The British economy did not collapse in one dramatic moment. It was not a single explosion or an instant disaster. Instead, it has been a slow suffocation, the kind of decline you barely notice until the damage is irreversible. In medicine, they say it is not the fall that kills you, but the sudden stop at the end. In economics, the tragedy is usually the opposite. Economic death is rarely sudden. It is a lingering illness, a slow puncture in the tire of a car speeding down the highway. You don't feel the air leaving at first. You only notice once the steering begins to shake and you realize you've already lost control. That is the story of modern Britain. This is not simply the story of Brexit as a political slogan or a cultural argument. It is not about speeches, campaign posters, or patriotic promises. This is about money. It is about the cold, unforgiving numbers that do not care about sovereignty, nostalgia, or national pride. Brexit was not the beginning of Britain's economic sickness. It was the final blow to a patient that was already weak. To understand why Brexit has left Britain poorer, we have to go back to the financial crisis of 2008. Before that crash, Britain felt rich. London was one of the financial capitals of the world. Credit was cheap, housing prices climbed every year, and government spending flowed freely. It looked like prosperity, but underneath, the British economy had become dangerously unbalanced. The country was no longer building wealth by producing things. It was betting on wealth through finance. Factories were replaced with trading floors, and manufacturing was hollowed out in favor of banking and speculation. When the American housing market collapsed, the shockwave hit Britain with extraordinary force. The UK banking system nearly imploded. The government was forced to spend billions of taxpayer pounds rescuing institutions like Royal Bank of Scotland and Lloyds. It was a humiliation, but the deeper damage was structural. The crisis shattered British productivity, the single most important driver of long-term prosperity. Productivity isn't exciting, but it determines everything. It is simply the amount of value a worker produces per hour. When productivity rises, wages rise. When productivity stalls, living standards stagnate. For decades, British productivity grew steadily, guaranteeing that each generation would be better off than the last. After 2008, it flatlined. Britain stopped becoming more efficient. Workers were still working hard, but they were no longer producing more value. Economists called it the productivity puzzle, and no one could fully explain why the engine had seized up. Then came the Conservative government in 2010, inheriting a broken economy. Their response was austerity. They slashed public spending, cutting investment in infrastructure, education, and services. The idea was that shrinking the government would unleash private sector growth, but instead, businesses froze. Investment stayed low. The recovery became the slowest in modern British history. Wages stagnated. For the first time in centuries, British workers experienced a decade where their real pay actually declined. By the time Britain reached 2016, the public was exhausted. People had lived through years of cuts, shuttered libraries, strained hospitals, and frozen wages. Meanwhile, the bankers who helped cause the crisis returned to collecting massive bonuses. The country was angry. Resentment built like dry powder waiting for a spark. That spark came from Prime Minister David Cameron. Cameron was facing rebellion inside his own party over Europe, and the rise of UKIP threatened conservative support. So he gambled. He called a referendum on leaving the European Union, not because he believed it was good for Britain, but because he believed it would silence his critics and secure his power. Every serious economist warned it would damage the economy. Cameron assumed voters would never choose economic self-harm. He was wrong. On June 23, 2016, Britain voted to leave. Markets had expected a Remain victory. The pound traded around $1.50, the currency of a stable G7 nation. Then results began rolling in. Sunderland, a working-class city dependent on EU trade through its Nissan factory, voted overwhelmingly for leave. Traders realized the unthinkable was happening. Panic erupted. The pound collapsed off a cliff, plunging more than 10% overnight. That kind of crash is what happens to unstable developing nations, not one of the world's oldest economies. That night marked the beginning of Britain's slow decline. Cameron resigned immediately, leaving chaos behind. There was no plan. The leaders of the Leave campaign had sold a dream, not a strategy, and the economy does not wait for politicians to improvise. Uncertainty is poison to business. If companies do not know what the rules will be in 2 years, they don't invest, they don't expand, they sit on their hands. From 2016 onward, business investment in Britain flatlined. While America, Germany, and France kept growing, Britain stalled. This invisible cost is enormous. The factories never built, the machinery never upgraded, the jobs never created. Economists call it the lost growth, wealth that simply vanished because confidence evaporated. The currency crash also hit ordinary families. Britain imports nearly half its food and fuel. A weaker pound made everything more expensive. Inflation rose. Real wages, which had barely begun recovering, were hammered down again. It was a nationwide pay cut delivered slowly through shrinking products and rising grocery bills. Brexit supporters claimed a cheaper pound would boost exports, but modern Britain does not export raw materials. It exports complex goods like cars, pharmaceuticals, and engines, all of which rely on imported components. The weak pound made those inputs more expensive, canceling out any export advantage. There was no boom, only inflation. For years, Britain remained trapped in political paralysis. Theresa May struggled to negotiate a deal, held hostage by extremists demanding impossible outcomes. Full market access without free movement or EU regulations. The EU refused. Britain could not have its cake and eat it. Businesses warned supply chains would break. Honda closed its Swindon plant. Thousands of jobs vanished. In 2019, Boris Johnson rose to power promising to get Brexit done. Exhausted voters wanted closure. Johnson signed a hard Brexit deal that erected trade barriers with Britain's largest partner. On January 1, 2021, the reality arrived quietly. Trucks delayed, paperwork exploded, and small exporters collapsed. A small cheese producer who once shipped easily to Paris now faced customs forms, veterinary certificates, delays, and higher costs. Thousands of businesses simply stopped exporting. Britain had imposed economic sanctions on itself. Trade with the EU fell sharply. The government's own forecasters estimated Brexit would permanently shrink the economy by 4%, around £100 billion a year. That's more than the education budget, money lost forever. Then came labor shortages. Ending freedom of movement drove out European nurses, drivers, and farm workers. Crops rotted in fields. Restaurants struggled to staff kitchens. Britain even faced a fuel crisis in 2021, not because petrol was scarce, but because drivers were missing. The damage spread to London's financial sector. Brexit ended passporting rights, stripping banks of automatic access to EU clients. Slowly, assets moved to Frankfurt, Dublin, Paris, and Amsterdam. London remained large, but its dominance faded. The golden goose was strangled. Britain's reputation shifted. Once seen as a stable haven, it began to look volatile and unpredictable, with revolving prime ministers and broken treaties. Investors demanded a Brexit premium, higher returns to lend Britain money. That premium exploded in September 2022 with Liz Truss. Her unfunded tax cuts triggered market panic. Bond yields spiked. Pension funds nearly collapsed. The Bank of England was forced into an emergency bailout. The pound hit record lows. Truss lasted just 44 days, but the damage was permanent. Mortgage rates soared. Trust in Britain's institutions cracked. Today, the consequences are everywhere. Britain has grown far less than the US or Eurozone since the referendum. Households are poorer than they would have been. Public services crumble. NHS waiting lists stretch into millions. Schools decay. Infrastructure breaks down. Economic decline is not cinematic apocalypse. It is gray stagnation. Higher bills, longer waits, worse services. Industries promised a golden age instead received funerals. Fishermen lost access to EU markets. Farmers were undercut by cheap imports. Car manufacturers face looming tariffs. Scientists endured brain drain after losing EU research funding. Even the Union itself has cracked, with Scotland pushed towards independence and Northern Ireland destabilized by new borders. Brexit was sold as taking back control. Instead, immigration hit record highs, only from farther away. Sovereignty became an expensive illusion. You cannot eat sovereignty. You cannot heat your home with it. Polls now show most Britons believe Brexit was a mistake, but undoing it will take decades if it can be undone at all. Britain is stuck, drifting between Europe and America, belonging fully to neither. Brexit stands as a warning to the world. Prosperity is fragile. Populism has consequences. Economics does not care about flags or nostalgia. Britain chose fantasy over reality, and now the bill has come due. The bullet fired in 2016 did not kill instantly, but the wound never healed. Britain is bleeding slowly, growing weaker year by year. This is how a great power became a diminished one, not through war, but through a vote.